Hi, good morning, everybody. So this is going to be the first part of our Section 3 lesson. I'm breaking it up into two parts because Section 3 is a little bit longer. So this will be the first half of the notes, and then we'll do the second half tomorrow. All right? But for today, we're just going to do the first half, and it should set the stage up nicely for this conflict that we're going to be talking about. All right? Now, this conflict, which will become known as the 7 Years' War, which you can see right down here, right? 7 Years' War. It will give rise to a lot of things that you may still recognize today. One of which is the Cajun culture, if you know what the Cajun culture is. The Cajuns are a group of people who live in modern day Louisiana. They came from Canada. They came from somewhere called Acadia. And when the British conquered Acadia at the end of this conflict, a lot of people would flee and go to Louisiana, which was predominantly French at the time, right? And that would give rise to the Cajun culture and the Cajun people, which the food is supposed to be very good if you've ever been down in Louisiana. And another thing which you may have been heard this called, right? I just called it the 7 Years' War, but you may have heard it been called the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War is a bit of a confusing name because that makes it think that the war was between the French and the Indians, when in reality, a better name would be the British versus the French war with Indians on both sides, which is a bit of a mouthful. So we just call it the French and Indian War, but still that's a little bit confusing. All right, but just know that it was a war between the British and the French, and the Indians fought on both sides. So, origins of the conflict. By 1754, there were three European powers in North America: Great Britain, France, and Spain, right? So, if you're looking at your guided notes, we got Great Britain. I spelled it wrong. There we go. Great Britain, France, or France, as the French say, and Spain, or as the Spanish say, España. All right? Great Britain, France, and Spain. And if you know anything about British and French history, is that the British and French, they like to go to war with one another. They go to war with each other a lot. It's kind of like their national pastime, right? Going to war, the British and the French with each other. And by the time of this war, the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, they had just finished a war like 15 years ago, right? They just finished a war like 15 years ago. Now they're going to go to war again. And then at the end of this war, there'll be another war in 10 years, right? The British and the French will go to war again with each other in 1776 when the French join our side in the Revolutionary War. All right? But what they're going to be fighting over this time is this area, right? Hopefully you can see my little cursor. Is this area. You can see these areas of land which the striped lines. This indicates disputed territory. Area which both sides are claiming, area that both the French and the English are claiming. They're both claiming this area. And this area is known as the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River Valley. So for number 2, you could put down Ohio or Ohio River Valley. Ohio River Valley is technically more correct, but Ohio works just fine. And why this area of land is so important is there's a series of rivers which run from about here, right, in western Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, and they run down this way, and then they feed into this really powerful and important river, which goes by the name of the Mississippi. And rivers are very important back in this time because rivers are basically like free highways, free roads that you don't have to pay for, and it makes transporting people and trade goods very easy. All right, you can make a lot of money controlling these rivers. And you'll find throughout most of history that a lot of wars are started because of money, because of cash and economic problems. And this war will be no different. This war will be no different. So both sides really want to control this region of the Ohio River Valley. Or you could just write down Ohio, whatever works for you. And we'll talk about a little bit more about this tomorrow about the reasons why each side really wants to win this war in more extent, because there's more reasons that each side wants to win this war. And we'll talk about that. All right? We will talk about that. Moving on. So many countries would fight in this thing called the 7 Years' War. And it would be fought all over the world, right? We have, if you look at the map here, we have fighting in North America, fighting in South America, fighting off the coast of Africa in these colonies. There was lots of fighting, lots of important battles fought in Europe. There was also lots of really important fighting in India between the French and the British. If you're ever interested in that, there are some really, really cool and important battles that happened at this time. And there was lots of fighting in the Philippines. So it was a big global conflict. Some people call it World War Zero, and some people call it the first global conflict. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it. There was lots of fighting all over the world. But in North America, we tend to call it the French and Indian War. French and Indian War. French and Indian War. All right? And you don't need to know the other participants. There were lots of them. But the two, which I just felt like I should mention just out of a sake of natural curiosity, is Prussia, who fought with the British, and Austria, who fought with the French. Both Prussia and Austria were German-speaking countries. There was no idea of Germany at this point in history, and there won't be for roughly 100 more years at this point. So, but Prussia and Austria are the two biggest German-speaking countries because there's a lot at this point in history. And they will go to war for some little piece of land, which seems kind of irrelevant now, but it led to a really big war. But we're not going to focus on the European countries or on the European theater. We're going to focus on North America between the British and the French, all right? Between the British and the French. So did the American Indians fight for the British or the French? Well, they fought for both sides of the conflict, and that's why it's called the French and Indian War, because Indians fought on both sides of the conflict. They fought on both sides of the conflict. So both. But did they prefer the British or the French? And we'll get into a little bit more depth tomorrow about which one they really preferred. But take my word for it, they preferred the French. The French treated the Indians better. The British and their colonists were, for lack of a better, they didn't treat the American Indians all that well. And we'll go over a little bit about that tomorrow. But just take my word on it that the most Indians preferred the French. But there were some who fought for the British, okay? So, as I mentioned earlier, about 15 years earlier, there was a war between the British and French. And so they're going to war again. That's just the thing that British and French people do. They go to war with each other. And they'll keep doing it over and over again for like every 10 years until like 1817 or something like that. The war started on 1754. And ended in 1763. So, all my math people out there, 1763 minus 1754, it does not equal 7. In fact, it equals 9. 9 years. And you may be asking yourself, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why did that happen? And the reason for this, the reason why this happened is that the 7 Years' War was more like a bunch of little wars that all sort of started at different points, right? So like the American fighting in the war, this part started in 1754, but the fighting in Europe and the fighting in India didn't start until 1756. And so because our world is sort of Eurocentric, we focus a lot on Europe. We call it the 7 Years' War because from Europe's perspective, it only lasted 7 years from 1756 to 1754. But in the United States, it lasted 9 years, which is kind of funny. It gets complicated, and as long as you realize that it's not that important. It's supposed to be confusing. So if you're confused, that's okay. That is more than okay. You're allowed to be confused for this, but just know that it lasted 9 years, but it's called the 7 Years' War, all right? The war started, or what helped start the war, was that a 22-year-old George Washington, lieutenant colonel, I believe his rank was, ambushed a French patrol in Pennsylvania, right around here, around Pittsburgh. I think it was near Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne. And he was one of the people who helped start the war. Now, for those of you who know your American history, you know that George Washington would become very famous in the Revolutionary War as the general of our army. And he would also become the first president of the United States, right? That's George Washington. So George Washington would get a lot of experience. He's just a young man. 22 is very young, especially for leading soldiers, all right? But he'd get a lot of experience in this war, fighting for the British, because he was a British soldier at this point in time. The conflict quickly escalated into a war, with Indian nations choosing sides. The Iroquois and the Cherokee would fight alongside the British, and the Abenaki and the Mi'kmaq would fight mainly with the French. But remember, this is important to note, most Indian tribes fought with the French. Some fought with the British, but most fought with the French. Most fought with the French. So which tribes fought for the French? We have our Abenakis and our, I'm going to try and spell this right. I think that's right. I think that's how I spelled it before. Yeah, the Abenakis and the Mi'kmaq. And for the British, we have our Iroquois and our Cherokees. All right? But remember, most would fight for the French. The French are the people who treated the American Indians usually better than the British and their colonists, okay? Most would fight for the French. And so tomorrow we will look at sort of what each side, right, what France was hoping to get out of this war, what Great Britain was, and what the American Indians were. And then we'll look at the outcome as well. We'll do that tomorrow. But for now, I just sort of wanted to set the stage for the war, right? What the war is going to happen and why each country it's important for both France and the British and the American Indians, why it's important for them to win this war. Because history is about asking the why questions. And you want to know the whys. You want to know why things happened the way they did. All right. All right. Well, thank you for listening. If you finish this assignment, get it submitted and you'll be good for today. All right. If you have any questions, you can always let me know by my email and I will respond as soon as possible. All right. Well, have a nice day and I will see you when I see you then.